Welcome to this episode of Midlife Men with me, Philip Briscoe. In this episode, I am joined by Dr. Danny Brassell. Danny is a very well-known keynote speaker, best-selling author and coach, and his mission is to bring joy back into the classroom and the workplace. So welcome, Danny.
Thanks so much for having me, Philip. More importantly, thanks for bringing some joy around the world. I really appreciate all you're doing.
Fantastic. Thank you. So what we're going to talk about today is a bit more focused on men and how many men struggle to express themselves. And that could be verbally, through literacy, but also through their emotions. And, the result of this can be lack of confidence, increased anxiety. So, Danny, perhaps you could start by talking about your experience of working with men and how you see these sorts of challenges manifest.
Well, that's why I'm so appreciative for your podcast, Philip. I mean, men, you and I are both qualified. We're both men, and we're horrible about expressing our emotions. We bottle it in, and that's why I really think men need a forum like this. They need to understand that they're not alone. And that's when I'm working with people, that's the first thing I say. I work a lot with entrepreneurs and business owners and executives that they'll have stage fright, lack of confidence. And so I share with them. I was in India about 6 years ago, speaking to a school, pumping up all the kids. And afterwards, this 6-year-old boy comes up to me. He's got tears in his eyes. And I noticed, Philip, that he's missing his left arm. And he just looks up at me and he's like, well, how can I succeed? And I crouched down to his eye level and I said, well, when I was your age, I went to 18 different schools before I was 12 years old. Everybody used to call me stupid because I stuttered. And eventually I went to a school where a teacher, she took me aside and she'd work with me one-on-one and she would sing things to me. And I found I could sing them back without my stutter, kind of like the movie The King's Speech. And eventually I lost my stutter and I became a swan. But I looked into that boy's eyes and I said, isn't it interesting that the little boy that everybody used to make fun of because he couldn't speak right now gets paid ridiculous sums of money to travel the planet to do what? And he just gets the biggest grin on his face. He says, speak. I said, don't let anybody ever tell you what you can't do. This is what I'm a big believer in this. People need support. You and I know this, especially after the pandemic. I guarantee you there's people out there that are hurting. And it's really important that people understand that they're not alone and this too shall pass. So, that's really my message to guys is, you're not alone. All of us struggle. And what I try to do is figure out healthy outlets for all of us. And I do that by basically talking about all my problems from a stage.
And why do you think men in particular have these, anxieties around, opening up, perhaps sharing their vulnerabilities? What do you think the causes of that are?
We have no practice, Philip. I mean, I drove my youngest teenage daughter. I drove her to a concert yesterday with her 3 friends, and I was just listening to them. I'm like, holy cow! They're like helping one another out with their relationship issues. And guys don't talk about that. You get a couple of guys together, and they'll just sit at the pub and watch a game on TV, and that's about the highest degree of intimacy between men. We don't talk about feeling, imposter syndrome, like maybe I shouldn't be here and things like that. And that's, again, this is why your audience, they need to be hearing this. It's, you're not alone. It's the same thing as I talk to people about stage fright. I'm like, Barbara Streisand, Adele, they always have had stage fright before they go on stage. Hugh Grant has horrible stage fright. Emma Stone, Academy Award winning Best Actress, she has stage fright. President Reagan used to puke before he gave every speech. He had stage fright. So you're in good company. There's a woman I really loved, Brene Brown. She has a great book called Dare to Dream. And it's really one of the first strategies I share with people when they get on a stage. I always say, well, don't talk about your successes, talk about your failures, because not everybody in your audience has succeeded, but they've all failed. And the more you talk about your own vulnerabilities, the more you're going to be able to connect with your audience. And so that's really, again, I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but that's what I appreciate about your forum is there's guys out here, they don't know how to communicate and they just need to understand they're not alone.
Do you think it's hardwired? Do you think it's certainly of men who are a bit older? Do you think it's down to, societal or environmental, the way they were brought up?
Yeah, my answer to that is I don't know. I'm not sure on that because they have the studies where they give the girl like the toy gun and the boy the doll, and within like 10 minutes the little girl is dressing up the toy gun and the boy is trying to shoot things with the doll. So I'm like, well, that seems to be ingrown. I don't know if that was societal or if that was just the boy. I mean, boys are rougher. I've taught all ages. When I was teaching my kindergarten boys, I used to just be humiliated. I'm like, my gosh, I don't know how we've ever evolved. Girls are so much brighter than little boys. But so that's a good question. I don't know. And I've never actually seen any research that conclusively proves one or the other. I mean, I definitely believe that when you are brought up in an environment where it's nurturing and people are sharing their feelings, obviously you're going to be more like that. But there's something to be said. Maybe, the caveman in us, we're just, we're a little bit rougher around the edges than the girls.
And how about, in terms of, you were talking about, high level business professionals. What about, your average guy in the street has always had a problem with perhaps, reading, writing, perhaps missed out on school. Where does somebody start there when the fear, the anxiety caused by perhaps having to admit or being seen to not be able to express themselves properly? Where do they start really in terms of trying to address those issues?
That's a great question, Philip, because and this one I do believe is societal. I'm not as familiar with the schools in the UK. I'm pretty familiar with them, but I'm not as familiar with them as the American school system. But the American school system, when I was a teacher, and I've taught all age levels, 96% of the teachers for kindergarten, first and second grade kids, these are 6, 7, and 8-year-olds, 96% of those teachers are female. I believe it's a theory. But I believe when teachers are reading to the kids or whatever, they're actually, I'll give a better example. There's a great book, one of the Diary of the Wimpy Kid books by Jeff Kinney. The mother decides she's going to do a mother-son book club. And so she invites all the neighborhood boys to her house and they all have to bring a book. And so the mom, the books she brought were like Little House on the Prairie, Anne of Green Gables, Little Women. And the boys, the books they brought are like How to Cheat at Video Games, Dinosaurs, Monster Trucks, The Book of Bodily Functions. And I observed that firsthand when I was teaching little kids I had a boy when I was teaching second grade, Kiara, and Kiara's first grade teacher told me, Kiara don't know nothing. I'm like, well, thank you for that. Well, Kiara, who don't know nothing, comes into my classroom one day and he's like, hey, Mr. Brassell, you see Barkley last night? He had 18 points and 16 boards. I'm like, thank you, Kiara, because from that day forward, after lunch every day, I'd sit him on my lap. We'd read the LA Times sports page. And guess what? By the end of the year, he was one of my best readers. And all that kid ever read about was sports. Now, do I think Shakespeare's important? Yes, but I always point this out to parents. The little boy who only reads Captain Underpants is going to become a better reader than the little boy who refuses to read anything. I mean, Captain Underpants is the gateway drug to Shakespeare. I had the same experience when I was a kid, even in high school. I remember a teacher forced us to read The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And no offense to fans of Nathaniel Hawthorne, but the book is basically about Hester Prynne commits adultery, and so she's forced to wear an A on her chest. And I raised my hand in class and I asked my teacher if I could wear a B on my chest because I was so bored reading that book. And so getting to the heart of your question, the reason a lot of these guys don't have confidence is they were forced to read stuff they had no interest in whatsoever. I mean, I have friends that went to Ivy League schools, love to brag about that was the last time they read a book. I'm like, well, you're an idiot. I've got friends that didn't graduate high school, but they're avid readers, but they're not reading like Dostoevsky or Jane Austen. They're reading personal development books, or they're reading business books, things that interest them. And so getting back, this is a long answer to your short question, but getting back to what's the first step a guy can do is figure out, the research is actually very clear on this. It doesn't matter what you read. What matters is how much you read. It doesn't matter if you're reading James Joyce or James and the Giant Peach. People who read more read better. And I think the problem, and I do believe this is societal, I think people have been forced to read things that, I'll give you another example. I was doing a podcast for a Nigerian station just last week, and they asked the same type of question. I said, the problem I see in Nigeria is it's been a free country since 1960, but it's still under the British schooling system. And so kids are forced to read Shakespeare and Dickens and Jane Austen. And there's nothing wrong with those authors. They're fantastic. But I think maybe some of those kids would love to read like Nigerian authors like Chinua Achebe. That might be something more of interest to them. So for the guys out there trying to figure out, where do I start? If you like reading the sports page, read the sports page. If you like to, I don't know. When I used to volunteer at a juvenile detention facility for teenage girls, and they said there was no way I was going to get those girls interested in reading. It took me a week. Philip, a week later, we were reading the back of Us magazine. There's a section called The Fashion Police, which is all these comedians ripping on celebrity outfits. And these girls couldn't get enough of those little put downs. That was the entry point. That's how I got them interested. Same thing with guys, is I'm always looking at, what are you interested in? I had a little boy. They said he didn't know anything. I'm like, ask him about the Stegosaurus. The kid knows every fact about the Stegosaurus. I mean, he can't write his name, but he knows every fact about a Stegosaurus. So that's the starting point. So the guys that are, I am going to say this. This is societal. I see this. I think schools really do a bad job of fostering the interest of each individual kid. It's tougher to teach individual kids than to teach an entire class, but that's what effective teaching really is. Long answer to your short question, Philip. Sorry.
That's great. So I guess fundamentally, we're taking the same approach to teaching literacy in schools, and one size doesn't fit all. You need to find individual ways to relate to different people, I guess is what you're saying. And that's the only way to really get everybody reading and everybody happy, because they're doing things they enjoy, reading things they enjoy.
Absolutely. I don't like required reading. You can still fulfill the objective without saying that, Mark Twain was happy when he graduated school because he said, oh, I can stop reading literature. Most people are force-fed literature, and I'm not putting down literature. I love literature, but some kids, that's not how you're going to get them interested in reading it. In my experience, when I get the kid interested, that's when they're willing to start reading other things. I mean, I love using poetry with a lot of my struggling readers because poems are short and they're easy to remember, and a lot of them rhyme. And it's a really great entry point. If I can get kids reading poetry, that's one of my, or song lyrics, that's another way I get kids interested in reading.
So for men, for older guys who have struggled with reading their whole lives, how do you get them into reading? What's the process you'd undertake, especially if they have always shied away from it because, they've just felt stress whenever they've tried to read?
Yeah. I mean, they were forced on that stress. I mean, the first point I will show people, that's what I love about YouTube videos, is we find that 80% of YouTube videos, people aren't listening to the sound because they're watching them at work. And so they're closed caption. They're looking at the text. That's the starting point I would do with a lot of guys. I'm like, hey, people have defined reading as, reading Dostoevsky. Well, yeah, that's one form of reading, but reading can be poetry. Reading can be just a quick newspaper advertisement. There's lots of different forms of reading, and it's almost elitist. I see that people are saying, well, this isn't reading. I'm like, the typical human being today in one day encounters more text than a person growing up in the 19th century encountered their entire life. And so you have to broaden the definition of literacy. And again, this confidence factor, I'll give you an example. Your podcast, Philip, the first time you did it, it stunk. And the second time you did it, it stunk, but it stunk a little bit less than the first time. And now you've been doing it so much, you're used to, okay, this is my format. This is how I talk to the guests. These are the questions I format. And that's how you built up your confidence. It's the same thing with anything. I've never baked chocolate chip cookies, and I guarantee you the first time I bake them, they're not going to be that great, but they'll be reasonable. And the second time I bake them, they'll be a little bit less bad, but they'll still be bad. But by the 20th and 30th time, it'll be a lot better. Same thing with speaking, same thing with reading, same thing with anything. That's how the way you build confidence is you give people a routine. I always say resolutions fail, routines, that you form habits. And the more you follow the routine, it's kind of like when you drive home. I would say take a different route home. You're not going to like that because you're used to your routine of how you get home. Oh, I know the quickest way. If Danny tells me to go a different way, it's going to make me a little bit uncomfortable. Well, I always encourage people, get comfortable being uncomfortable. That's how you're going to get better at a lot of different things.
And do you see some guys being held back, in perhaps their careers or just life in general because they feel that they can't overcome challenges related to expressing themselves, however that may be, orally or reading or writing? Do you see them kind of blossom and fulfill their real potential once they kind of get over the challenges?
Of course. Absolutely. I mean, your story's still being written. I mean, I've changed my career like 7 times already. I'll probably change it another 7 times. I just read a great book by Barbara Oakley, Mind Shift, and the whole book is nothing but examples of people who later in life, and it was fascinating to me because it would be like an artist who always thought he was bad at math, who wound up becoming a computer programmer and now is like a math expert teaching math. I think most of us fail to consider that we were born to be extraordinary, and society often, wants to label us and hold us back. I see a lot of people, not just guys, women too. It drives me crazy. I'm like, you have no idea how gifted you are, but people have put you down. I mean, I was blessed. I had a mom and a dad who encouraged me my entire life. I know a lot of people don't have that, and a lot of my students definitely didn't have that. And so I used to look at my students every single day. I said, sometimes you need somebody else to believe in you before you believe in yourself. I believe in all of you. They only give me the best and the brightest. Now let's go out and make this world a better place. I mean, you hear that enough, you start to believe it. I see a lot of people that weren't fed. I mean, I was watching a horrible show on TV last week called The News, and it totally depressed me because it was nothing but society's failures. That's why I don't watch the news. I listen to inspiring podcasts. I read inspiring books. I make a conscious decision. I'm not going to let all this negativity around me affect me at all. And so I'm going to try and do whatever I can to surround myself with positivity.
And then going back to your early experience then, and you talked about suffering with a stutter when you were a child. At that point, you met an amazing teacher that helped you overcome your stutter. Did that set you on the path you're on now? Did you decide then, I want to help other people?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely helped me having another person. I mean, my parents always encouraged me. I was blessed. When I finally retired from teaching, I was at a party and my mom was talking to my high school English teacher, and they didn't know I was listening to their conversation. And my high school English teacher, she said, it's such a shame that Danny stopped teaching. He was such a great teacher. And my mom replied, but Danny's good at everything he does. Well, that's the environment I grew up in. When you have a person giving you that kind of positive encouragement, of course I'm going to succeed. I mean, what I'm amazed with, I'm a basketball fan, and I look at a guy like LeBron James, one of the greatest basketball players to ever live, and he grew up without a father. And I'm like, how did he turn out so? He didn't even go to college, and yet he has all these different business opportunities. When he was 18 years old, he took his best friend and paid for his college education and business school so he could become his agent. I'm like, how does an 18-year-old kid figure that out? That's just extraordinary. I mean, I shared with you earlier, I was just speaking in South Africa last week, and I went to Robben Island and just learned more and more about Mandela. And I don't understand where this guy came from. This guy thought in a totally different way. And so what I've made a conscious decision for me is I want to learn from those people. This is a person that looks at the world in a totally different way. And I would encourage anybody to read Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. But what I learned at Robben Island, which I didn't know, was when Mandela left the presidency of South Africa, he refused to talk politics ever again because he didn't want other people compared to him. He's just an extraordinary human being. I'm like, where do these people come from? So, there's people both living and dead that we can learn from. That's why I love reading now. I was happy when I got my PhD. My wife's like, why are you so happy? I'm like, because from now on, I can read what I want to read. And I read about successful people. I'm just constantly reading about, and it gets to kind of what you were talking about, Philip. I read lots of biographies. And one thing that strikes me about most biographies is most of these people dropped out of school, which tells me what's wrong with school? What are we doing wrong? How do we make sure not to lose those kids? And that was basically my motivation being a teacher, is I can be the one male role model, a positive male role model to a lot of these kids. And so I took it very seriously. So I think a lot of the guys out there, and I work with, when I used to be an adult literacy volunteer working with people that 50, 60, I had an 80-year-old guy. He learned how to read at age 80. Well, that's great. I love that he had that attitude. It doesn't matter what my age is. I'm not in the ground yet. I can still contribute to society.
I love your optimism and the fact that you believe that people can evolve and they can improve their lives, and to some degree they have to take the first steps. So for guys listening to this podcast, and you reference some very inspirational, well-known people there, how can people take small steps to perhaps change? Maybe they're stuck in a job they don't like, they don't feel they are qualified to do anything else, or maybe there are other problems they've got. Maybe they have issues with substance abuse, etc. What advice would you give them just to start moving out of that stage and start to have a different life? What can they do?
Yeah, so I always tell people E squared, R squared. E squared is eliminate excuses, and R squared is remove roadblocks. And so I can't stand excuses. Drives me nuts. I used to tell my team, I'm like, whenever you need to give me an excuse, just say Peru has a new dictator. And they're like, what's that got to do with anything? I'm like, well, one excuse is as good as another. It didn't get done, did it? There is no excuse now. I mean, maybe if you grew up 200 years ago, but look at this. You're in England. I'm in the United States. We're able to communicate via Zoom right now. That's unfrickin' believable. I get very excited. Everybody else will give you the doom and gloom about AI. I hired an AI coach to teach me AI. He's a medical doctor. His father died of pancreatic cancer. So he's developed an AI that can detect pancreatic cancer in stage 1. And he told me, Danny, just so you know, the first American to reach 150 years old has already been born. I mean, he gives me the possibilities about AI. I get excited about technology. I'm like, well, right now there's some barefoot kid on a dirt floor in Cambodia. Mom and dad aren't home. Maybe he hasn't eaten breakfast. But if he has a computer and an internet connection, he has the same access as the head of Google. The whole world just got a whole lot smaller. And so the baby steps getting to I know the long way around to get to answering your question, but do something small. So, for example, every day I made a decision. I'm going to read, when I wake up, I'm going to read for 10 minutes, something positive. 10 minutes. That's what my commitment is. Then I made a commitment. Okay, every day I'm going to exercise for at least 30 minutes. 30 minutes. I can do that. I have a pre-week planner. I actually pre-week plan on Sunday morning. I have this planner where I basically sketch out how I'm going to spend all the minutes or whatever. I went to a seminar, a time management seminar, and the guy leading it, he said, just so you know, there's no such thing as time management. There's only priority management. All of us have 24 hours in our day. And it was worth going to the seminar just because the homework before we attended the seminar was for 2 weeks to just write down how we spent every minute of our day and to be honest about it. And so I did it, Philip. And in those 2 weeks, each week I found I had spent over 12 hours a week on social media. So I guess the heart of the answer to your question, it's little things. I mean, you don't have to have a dime. And if you go on and if you have an internet connection, there are so many. You live right outside Oxford. I know for a fact Oxford offers all kinds of incredible classes that you can take online for free. Harvard, some of the best universities on the planet do that. I don't even think that those are that important. I'd rather watch YouTube videos where I watch people, teach me things that I never had an interest. There's a guy, Mark Rober, used to work for NASA and Apple, and he does all these great little videos, science videos that I'm like, wow, if this guy had been my science teacher, I would have become a scientist. When I read the book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman by Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner in physics, I'm like, if this guy had been my teacher, I would have been a physicist. So it's little things, baby steps. You just make routines. Again, I always say resolutions fail. Most people, they make their New Year's resolutions and they've already broken them by January 15th. Just make something really tiny. Like, hey, I mean, that's what I did when I did my dissertation. My refrigerator was never cleaner in my life, because every time I looked at that blank screen, I'm like, I got to go rearrange some condiments. And so finally I just decided I'm going to write a page a day, and in 365 days, I will have a 365 page document. And that's how it got done.
That's right, isn't it? You just have to put that first step out there. You can't sit there wondering what you could do in the future. You've just got to go and do it. And in fact, if you fail and make mistakes, that's even better, because you learn from them. And as you said, the volume of information out there at our fingertips is more than there has ever been before. So there is kind of no excuse. But just talking a bit about adult literacy. So you mentioned that you used to volunteer literacy centers. So how do they work? I mean, if you really are struggling with basic literacy, how do you go about finding help?
Yeah, so go to your local library. Most public libraries have some kind of adult literacy training program. That's what I used to volunteer. Most rewarding thing in my life. One of the things you'll see is a lot of people, the reason they don't read very well is because they might have a reading disability. Now, all reading disabilities are curable. Most common reading disability is dyslexia. And, famous people like, Whoopi Goldberg, Tom Cruise, Sir Richard Branson, these are all, George Washington was dyslexic. And so the interesting thing with dyslexics is they seem to process information better with their ears than with their eyes. And so one of the strategies I would do with my dyslexics, I'm like, well, let's start listening to Audible books. The research is very clear on this. Listening to a book is just as good as reading it on your own. It's a great step. There's strategies. I'm not a big phonics-based guy just because English is not a phonics-based language. Spanish is. I can teach anybody how to read in Spanish in 6 weeks or less. Mame, mi, mo, mu. You look at the symbol A. In Spanish, it's ah. Always ah. In English, it's ah, a. Ugh. I mean, sounds like I'm about to vomit. Makes 18 different sounds. Not a very useful strategy. But that being said, there are things I do believe in when I'm working with both little kids and adults. The blends are fairly consistent in the English language. So, you put like a TR together, they're almost always going to make a tr sound. We'll work on things like that. I used to tutor high school athletes that had gotten full college scholarships in sports, but they were reading at a first grade level. And my job was to help them improve their reading so they'd be academically eligible. And so I had this one guy, he was 6'11", 295 pounds. He was going to be an offensive lineman at the University of Texas, and he read at a first grade level. And so what I said is, hey, what we're going to do, the problem with being a 12th grader, having a tough time reading and you're at a first grade level is first grade books are written about puppy dogs and butterflies and bunny rabbits. Well, 12th graders don't want to read about puppy dogs and bunny rabbits and those types of things. And so what I said to him, I said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to write a book for a first grade class, and then we'll read it to the first grade class. And I said, do you know what first graders like to read? He's like, no. I'm like, okay, well, I guess what we'll do is we'll read a whole bunch of these first grade books and figure out how to write this book. You see what I just did, Philip? I just gave him an excuse on why he's going to read first grade level books. And now when he's showing his friends, he's like, oh, the reason I'm doing this is because I'm writing a first grade book. And within 6 months, we were able to get him up to about a sixth grade reading level, which is remarkable in 6 months. But again, what I always tell people is I think schools do an adequate job of teaching kids how to read. But the question I always ask people is, what good is it teaching a person how to read if they never want to read? I teach kids why to read, because I've never had to tell a kid, go turn on the TV. I've never had to tell a kid, go play a video game. And I never want to have to tell a kid, go read. I want them to choose to do it because they love to do it. And again, the guys that are listening to this right now, the reason they're not reading very well is because they struggled when they were young and people made fun of them. And so they avoided it. We avoid things we don't feel good at. And what they need to do is set themselves up for success. And if we set them up in successful situations, same thing, I'm a coach as well. And I never play a first year kid in an important situation in a game. I let them learn. And then when we're already up several points, then I might put them in. But I'm not going to put them in a situation where they can fail. I'm only going to put them in a situation where they can succeed. I had teachers that, I stuttered and I couldn't read very well when I was a kid, and they'd make me read in front of the class and the kids were laughing and giggling. It made me feel horrible. Well, that's what a lot of the guys listening. It may have been reading in first grade, or maybe they made a presentation at work and somebody made some snide comment and you just avoid it. That one comment can get you to avoid something forever. So again, there's lots of different approaches, but my approach has always been you catch more flies with honey than vinegar.
And how about in the workplace? How do you help people in the workplace? Because perhaps it's stopping them getting a promotion, or they're just feeling very underconfident and exposed. Do you have kind of different approach when working with organizations, businesses?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what I do now more than anything is we work with people on, I call it a well-crafted story. Politicians would call it a stump speech. Superhero movies call it your origin story. Simon Sinek in his book Start With Why, he'd probably say it's your visionary statement. But this is what this is. You can call it peanut butter and jelly. It doesn't matter what you call it. But what this is this is how you introduce yourself to new audiences again and again. This is a speech that you practice again and again. And the more you do it, the better you get at it. And so I take my clients through a 5C process, beginning with clarity, which is the most important thing you have to ask yourself is, it's amazing to me how many people can't answer these two basic questions. First question is, who is your audience? And the second question is, what problem do you solve? If you can answer those two questions, you are in pretty good shape. But if you can't answer those questions, you're never going to understand what you're doing, and nobody else is going to understand what you're doing. This is amazing to me. I work with some pretty successful people, and they'll talk to me for a half an hour, and I'm like, but who's your audience? What problem do you solve? They can't answer those two basic questions. And so what we're trying to do is to help you. I mean, whether you're trying to get a promotion at work, you're trying to get venture capitalists to invest in your idea, you're trying to get, I work with pastors. How do you get people to tithe to your church? And so what we do is we shape personal stories. So here's a strategy I share with people all the time. So for your audience, sit in a comfortable chair with a pen and paper and libation of choice. And for an hour, just write down every story that's ever happened in your life. And I don't mean the entire story. I just mean triggers, like the time I locked myself out of the car in front of the grocery store, the time that dad spilt mustard on his tie at that fancy restaurant. You'll find in about 1 hour, you'll come up with 400 to 500 of these little stories. So that's the first part of the exercise. The second part of the exercise is then you try and figure out, well, what's this story really about? Oh, this is a story about accountability. Oh, this is a story about never giving up. Oh, this is a story about loyalty. And so I have on my computer literally tens of thousands of these files where it's like, oh, here's stories about love. Here's stories about perseverance. And so whenever I have to make a point, I'll use one of these stories. So for example, one of the techniques when we're crafting your well-crafted story is your call to action. There's two types of people in your audience. I call them the Joe Fridays and the Julia Roberts. The Joe Fridays will be stereotypical and say it's like the husband. Joe Friday is just the facts. How much is this going to cost? What's it going to take? How long is it going to be? What do I get out of this? That's one type of person in your audience. The other person is the Julia Roberts, which we'll say is the wife. And the Julia Roberts, she just wants to feel good. I don't care what it is, as long as it makes me feel good. And if you can make sure to structure your presentation to attract both of those people, you can. So for example, one of the actions I want people to do is why they should hire me, hire an expert. And so I'll say, my wife and I had theater tickets one night and we were dressed to the nines. And as we were driving to the theater, we got a flat tire. My wife said, well, I'm going to call the auto service. I'm like, we don't need to call them. I'm a man. I can change a tire. So I got the tire out of the back of the car, and then I got the thing that's shaped like an X and the pumper thing. And I started trying to change this tire. And 27 minutes later, I have grease all over me. My wife's just shaking her head like I could have done so much better than this. And unbeknownst to me, she had called the auto service. And this teenage kid, about 17 years old, shows up in a tow truck. And in about 3 minutes flat, he fixes the flat tire. I think there are times when all of us think we can do it ourselves. But if we want to save time, we want to save money, and we want to save a lot of headaches, you hire an expert. So that's how you collect stories to teach points to people. Walt Disney said people think in pictures. I'm a big believer in that. People think in stories. They don't remember, of all people, it was Joseph Stalin who said, 1 million people dead is a statistic. 1 person dead is a tragedy. Translation, facts tell, but stories sell. So it's the stories. Guys aren't going to remember any statistics. They're going to remember those emotional moments. And even if you are one of those Joe Fridays that wants to know the facts, the way you remember the facts is always through a story. It's the best way to, and this is since cavemen, this is how we've communicated.
And I guess what you're doing here, Danny, is you're giving people a voice, maybe for the first time, that they might never have had before. And using these sorts of techniques, empowers them to find their voice.
Well, I agree, Philip. I mean, yes, I've worked with people. I've worked with people that are Olympic gold medalists. I got this one guy, he climbed the highest peak on all 7 continents. He swam with sharks in Madagascar. He's done the Iditarod and the Arctic Circle. I look at him like nobody can relate to you. And this is a key point I want everybody in your audience to understand is that it's the little things that everybody can relate to. Not everybody in your audience has won a gold medal, but everybody in your audience has had a stupid argument with their spouse. Everybody in your audience, they've had that time where, you're arguing with your spouse. Well, the toilet paper should go over, not under. I mean, those are the things that can connect people. And that's what I'm looking for in the audience is, a lot of times people in my audience, you get the guys that are sitting there with their arms folded across their bodies, like they're very closed. And what I want to see is them leaning in and nodding in agreement. That's when I know. I worked with a financial advisor a couple of weeks ago, Richard. He started his presentation. He bragged about he's been a financial advisor for 30 years. He's made over $1 billion for his clients. He named all the famous people he worked with. And I said, Richard, this is all right, but you're not connecting with your audience. What are the 3 things you need to remember in real estate? And he said, what? And I said, location, location, location. So we put that part later on in his talk. And so we began his talk. Now he starts off talking about the very first client he got. And it's basically a comedy of errors. He made every mistake possible. And it's amazing the person actually signed up with him. And he told me 2 weeks later, he was doing a dinner presentation for about 15 couples. And usually he would see guys in the audience with their arms crossed. And now they're patting their knees because they're laughing so hard at all of his misfortunes. That's how you connect with people. This is why I love watching comedians. I think we don't laugh enough in the world. I think people need to chill out and laugh a lot more, especially, the guys listening today is, I could sit there and talk about all the horrible things that have happened to me. It's going to make people laugh, and the reason it's going to make people laugh is because I'm removed from them. It didn't happen yesterday. People make jokes about President Lincoln being assassinated in 1865. It probably wasn't so funny in 1865. So, that's where when you can see, and that's what I love. I love presenters that can take all of their, like me overcoming a stutter. I can talk about that freely now. I still stutter because I get excited and that's what causes my stutter, but I can laugh about it now because I'm a speaker. I've done this a while. That's what I want the guys to get that are listening to this is, experience.
So if you've got to do maybe a stand-up meeting tomorrow at work or a presentation, so key to it is know your audience and connect with them. Is that what people should keep in mind to be successful?
Yeah, absolutely. Most important thing is you have to, in the first 5 minutes of any presentation, your audience is making a decision. Am I going to be present or am I going to be engaged? And the way you keep them engaged is by painting pictures for them. And I'm a little bit different than a lot of coaches out there. A lot of people talk about your saddest moments all the time. And there's 3 reasons why I don't like to do that, Philip. First of all, the world just survived a global pandemic. Everybody's had a lot of bad stuff happen to them. I think we need more stories of hope, not sadness. Second of all, I'm helping you design a talk that you're going to deliver again and again. I don't know how people are able to talk about a child dying or their disease or something. I mean, I don't know how people do that all the time. You're going to deliver that 1,000 times. You're just going to be depressed. And third, and this is where people get angry with me, I have one objective when I'm on stage. I want people to leave feeling better than when they came in. I want them laughing, smiling, happy. I can tell the same joke again and again. And I believe there's something admirable about my objective, which is to get you feeling better about yourself. I believe these people that keep on telling the same sad story again and again, by the 20th time they've told it, now those are crocodile tears, and now they're being manipulative. And I'm not saying it's not an effective sales strategy. It's actually a very effective sales strategy. But I, for one, don't want to have to take a shower after I speak because I just manipulated my audience. I want them. I want this to be a win-win for. That's what. There's one book I could recommend to everybody in the audience, besides any of my books, would be Robert Cialdini's book Influence. I have so much admiration for him. He's a researcher. I think a professor emeritus from Arizona State, and he comes from the perspective, it's all research-based psychology, and he says the only way you should ever do anything is if it's a win-win. If it's not a win-win, don't do it. And I love that because it shows some integrity, which there's plenty of people out there without integrity.
Yeah, that's right. Let me ask you lastly then, Danny, just to round off then, what do you get most out of the work that you do? What kind of, at night you come home from a day, talking to people, helping them, what's the most overwhelming, positive, feeling that you get from your work?
Well, I mean, I love watching people laugh. I mean, there's also the negatives. I did a speech last week and 6 people complained about some of my jokes. And that's the problem with humor is everybody wants to be offended by something and it's always something different. I always share, I was doing, this is about 10 years ago, I was doing a reading presentation for some teachers. And I said, some kids don't like to read, so make sure if they don't like to read books, have magazines, have newspapers. Heck, you get a bunch of fat kids, give them menus. They'll read those. Well, 3 obese teachers complained. And so what I did is I just changed the joke. So now the joke is, some kids don't like to read books. So have magazines, have newspapers. Heck, when I was a kid, the only thing I liked to do was eat. You got a kid like that, give them a menu. As long as you put it back on yourself, you can avoid that. In terms of what gives me joy, I love seeing people, you had that word, confidence, people that lack that confidence and seeing them now attempt things that they never thought that they could do. People can go so much farther than they believe they can. And I love that. And I love working. There's a guy I'm working with later today, and I'm so proud of him because he did the work. He's come so far, and the reason he's come so far is it was brick by brick. He did the work. We've put together his presentation. He's listened to my feedback. He's taken the feedback. He's incorporated it, and it's wonderful. I mean, he has a program that he was getting about a 10% sales rate, and it's increased to 73% since we've redone his presentation. And that's really the only way I judge my effectiveness. Is it's not, do you feel better? Does your audience clap? I don't care about any of that. I want to see, is your audience going to take the next step with you? Whether that it can be an unpaid next step, like how many people subscribe to your newsletter or how many people booked a free call. It can be a paid offer, like how many people bought your product, how many people enrolled in your coaching program. But what we're trying to do all the time is how can I maximize your effectiveness so people say, you know what? Philip's a neat guy. I want to continue learning with him. I'm going to tune in next week to this podcast.
Danny, thank you so much for talking to us today. That's been really fascinating.
Thank you so much, Philip. As a thank you to you and everybody for having to bear with me, I want to give you a freebie. If you go to freestoryguide.com, again, freestoryguide.com, I'll give you a blueprint that'll help you design what we call your well-crafted story. What it is this is the blueprint that will help you design that talk. What it does for you is it takes the guessing out of you making presentations in public. And what this means for you is the peace of mind on how can you be more effective? How can you get that raise? How can you get that promotion? That's at freestoryguide.com. And Philip, again, I just really want to emphasize to you how much I appreciate all that you're doing. Guys you and I had this conversation before. We're a tricky sort. We like to bottle things in. And I think it's really important that guys understand that we're not alone. Somebody wants to buy me a margarita, I'll tell you all the things that have screwed up my life. And what I love is it's the same reason I love the movie Rocky. Rocky loses, but he doesn't lose because he went the distance. He never gave up against Apollo Creed, and that's why everybody loves Rocky. He takes a punch and gets right back up.
Brilliant. Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you for listening to the Midlife Men podcast with me, Philip Briscoe. If you're interested in adult literacy programs, then Danny's advice is to contact your nearest public library or adult education college. For those of you interested in improving your storytelling, Danny was talking about, then visit his website, freestoryguide.com. If you have a story to tell and you think your experience would help others, then please get in contact either via the website, mid-lifemen.com, or email me at midlifemen01@gmail.com. Finally, please share the podcast with people you know and with your networks. And if you enjoyed listening, then please rate or review it. It'll help raise its profile and reach more people who might benefit from the stories shared by my guests.